I swore that I wouldn't cry anymore. And then my mother was hanging from the ceiling.
Asuka Langley Soryu, and to a greater extent, Evangelion in general, is the kind of thing where, originally, from an outside perspective without much interpretation or sufficient interpretation, seems melodramatic or unnecessarily long-winded. Misconceptions can and usually is a byproduct of complex characters or story, and it certainly can come across that way when we hear simplistic or general census about some of the characters. Misconceptions like how Shinji is a whiny twat, Misato is a rubbish caregiver, Karu's gay, Ritsuko, Gendo, and the rest of the nerve personnel are deluded or stupid. And finally, Asuka is just a straight up bitch for no reason whatsoever. On the surface, none of these statements are particularly wrong, per se, but this being just the surface, it's a very basic and unthoughtful depiction of the cast. Evangelion is a show that starts off seemingly normal and matter of fact, but gradually delves into the reasoning and the why, the philosophy and psychology of the characters and story. The ending portion of the show, including the movies, absolutely outdoes itself to cohesively flesh out each and every concept and character of the show in such a graceful way that it would be insulting to parse each character in such a generic pool of simple-minded conclusions. Much like basically anything, giving a rudimentary evaluation about something won't lead to any kind of deeper understanding of it. Getting past a shallow outward perception or observations of something is when we start truly understanding and appreciating it with people with beliefs, concepts, and especially Evangelion. I have a lot of sympathy for the Evangelion cast. Most of the characters are relatable and are people you can see yourself in. And after giving everything so much thought, it's disheartening to hear someone simply conclude that Shinji's whiny and Asuka's a bitch, and that's the complete extent of their discernment. It's disheartening because those types of criticisms are the kind of ridicule misunderstood characters are expected to receive. This lack of others understanding them resonates in the same feeling someone may already have about themselves. Funny how that works. Well, some shows and movies struggle to even flesh out one or more characters. Almost every single character in Eva can be rooted to an intricate backstory with subtle details explaining how and why they are the way they are. I can easily go into depth rambling on about each character, but for the sake of this video, I want to just elaborate on my favorite character from the series, Asuka. Immediately after she's introduced in episode 8, we get an idea of her personality. She's made out to be this rambunctious, proud girl who's at a constant effort to prove her dominance for attention or acceptance. And she seems egotistical or proud, but this is, like how we stated earlier, nothing more than an outward facade she puts up from others, from her true feelings. This metaphorical wall she puts up to others extends more than just figuratively. She literally explains how, in Japan, the doors without locks is a lack of privacy. She demands Shinji not cross her impenetrable wall of Jericho. She's shown very early on to put up these mental and physical borders amongst herself and her acquaintances right from the start. Their meanings also perhaps hoping for the opposite outcome, but without getting too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about why she behaves like this. We need to go back to where it all started, at the beginning, her past. I'll be periodically throwing around Eva terminology, and I'll be speaking with the expectation that you've already familiarized yourself with Evangelion lore and the story. Asuka's backstory is explained in the later half of the show, but for chronological reasons, we'll talk about it now. To begin, just like every child attending their academic institution, they have some sort of family complications, primarily motherly issues. Unlike the rest of the potential Eva candidates, her past was arguably the most tragic. Every Eva pilot has their mother's soul, one way or another, implemented into the Evas themselves. Well, someone like Shinji also had a tough past. We know in his case, he was too young to even remember his mother's face. He even stated that he can't remember how she even looked like when visiting her grave with Gendo. Asuka, on the other hand, had a much more impactful turn of events regarding her mother. As part of the first contact experiment, Asuka's mother, Gyoko, was stripped of part of her soul. Kyoko didn't die from the contact experiment like most did. She remained alive but with a vital part of herself missing, and thus was left broken. The partial removal of her soul left her in this insane fixation of thinking her daughter was, in fact, a small porcelain doll. Asuka's mother figure at this point was taken away from her, and to make matters worse, her father soon after began an affair with Kyoko's doctor, whom he later married. Young Asuka was left virtually abandoned by the two people who should have been there most for her. With her father gone and her mother mentally unstable, paying attention to only a doll, it left Asuka starved for attention. This began Asuka's sad desire for attention and isolation and self-independence. As her mother drifts painfully into this spiral of insanity, Asuka is desperate for affirmation, for attention, for her mother basically. She would do anything for it. Asuka's mother then later commits suicide. In the final moments Asuka was with her mother, she asks her daughter if she would commit suicide with her. Poor Asuka accepts, saying, okay, I'll die with you, so please don't quit being my mother. Asuka was once again left abandoned after finding her mother's dead, decomposed body hanging from the ceiling. After this, Asuka vows to never depend on anyone again, because it leads to nothing but pain for her.
No, Mama! Don't leave me! I'll be good! Promise!
Your papa hates your mama. He doesn't need me anymore. And he doesn't want you either, Asuka.
I'm not wanted! I'm not worth anything!
Die with me.
No! I am not your doll! I'll think by myself and live by myself!
And then my mother was hanging from the ceiling.
Because of this, she puts up these metaphorical walls to others, while simultaneously, perhaps subconsciously also crying out for help, and hoping someone would break through her facade and see her for what she really was, a broken, sad girl. She is a complicated instance of a person who shuts everyone out, says she hates everyone, but really hates herself and simply wants to be loved. This is the root of Asuka's personality disorder or issues. Her obsession for attention was a result of her tragic childhood that only left her wanting to grow up as an adult as soon as possible. She associated her childhood with nothing but pain and sadness, so when she pursues Kaji or gets a remark by him or Misato about how she's still a child, it ruins her because being a child is what almost killed her.
I'm smart, you're dumb. I'm big, you're little. I'm right, you're wrong. And there's nothing you can do about it.
And there's also a reason why all the characters in Evangelion are so vaguely elaborated on. There's an interesting concept called Joyce's Epiphany, where in which it seems like the framework for Gainax, first of all, for Evangelion in general. The basic idea is that if you tell someone something very directly or clearly, they can process it, accept it, and move on. But if you tell them something in a very vague way, they'll need to think about it, analyze the information that's given to them, and that becomes sort of a personal experience. Evangelion is great at incorporating this in the story and characters. Fundamentally, you're investing your own personality in the show. You're adding depth by figuring out why everything is the way it is. What you get back is something that seems like it was perfectly meant for you, a feeling of resonation or understanding that you as the viewer form. It's not until much later on in the show is where we finally hear Asuka voice out how she really feels. She's often heard saying, "Look at me," because her mother never did, her father never did, no one ever has. And now, thinking she's grown up, she wants to prove her dominance. She wants to show that she's the greatest Eva pilot, but primarily she wants validation. Why do I pilot the Eva is synonymous with why do I exist or what is my purpose. Shinji is confused about his reasonings and often refers to doing it for recognition or gratification from his father. Asuka does it for the validation. She's a proud pilot and it's basically the only thing she has at this point. Another interesting tidbit to consider is that how every Eva plug suit plays a role in the show. with its visual meanings, that is. In episode 16, where Shinji is trapped inside the Eva core, it's shown that his plug suit is floating in LCL, and he was inside debating what is he without Eva, and if he was only truly appreciated because he was an Eva pilot. If you look at Asuka, she's very literally wearing her pride constantly with her red Eva plug suit hairpiece thing. Every Eva pilot wears these, but only while operating the Eva. Asuka is the only one that's constantly wearing hers as like a visual representation of her pride as an Eva pilot. Oddly enough, even in the shower. Strange. Asuka, in a sense, only wants to project the best of herself, her outward shell, if you will. She deems herself the best pilot, the most popular, and belittles basically everyone she meets. The only time she tries to retain any kind of attention from others is usually in a sexual or seductive manner. Her attempts to pursue Kaji or try to kiss Shinji or going to his bed, all these efforts usually end up in rejection. The importance of Misato's lavender perfume in episode 15 is detrimental to how Asuka really feels. Before going on a date with an acquaintance of Hikari, Asuka asks Misato if she could borrow her lavender perfume, to which she refuses and says it's not for a child.
I'm smart, you're dumb. I'm big, you're little.
Which later that night, once Misato comes back late home with Kaji, Asuka comes up close to him and smells Misato's perfume, sort of implying they were close together at the time. There are many direct parallels between the rocky and dependent relationship between Misato and Kaji that share or relate to Shinji and Asuka's relationship, but we'll discuss those a little bit later on. Her desperation for attention and validation becomes more evident as the show goes on, and it's soon realized that her behavior is more problematic or fanatic than it was made out to be at first. Later in the series, Asuka has troubles synchronizing with her Eva due to taking a hit to the ego from constantly being outperformed by Shinji and Rei, along with other reasons.
You anger too easily, and you're always menstruating. Stop it!
It was now with her crushed spirit that she had to go out and fight the angel Ariel. This angel, according to Ritsuko, was attempting to understand human psychology. And the angels in the past have attempted to make contact and understand humans, but this particular angel went into the mind of Asuka. It was only now that we learn about what had happened to Asuka, her mother, and why she behaves the way she does. Asuka is ultimately defeated, and to make matters worse, her entire struggle and reluctance to retreat was being broadcast to the nerve personnel. Asuka was incapable of controlling the situation, all while Ariel digs deeper into her psyche. Asuka's past with her mother's death, her sadness, her weaknesses were all being exposed to the viewer at this point. During this time of reflection, we see Asuka longing for her mother. We see this imagery of Asuka at a train crossing, reaching out for a figure we can presume is her mother, but she was just unobtainable. It reminded me of those dreams you may have where throughout the entire dream you're trying to desperately accomplish or obtain something but are just unable to, fumbling around and getting pushed further back the more you try. The same kind of frustration was captured perfectly here with Asuka yearning for her mother. So now that we know Asuka's full past, it's made clear why she acts so hostile or cruel to others. Take Rei, for example. We mentioned earlier how Asuka's mother idolized a doll as her own daughter. Understandably, Asuka hated dolls because it was the one thing her mother substituted in her place. A doll like an empty vessel, only capable of listening to her master, dependent on the master's orders, completely and utterly unable to think for itself. This is the doll, and this is how Asuka sees Rei. In the elevator scene, Asuka upright compares Rei to a doll, telling her she's nothing more than Gendo's puppet. Asuka suggests Rei would die if Gendo had ordered it, to which Rei responds and agrees she would. A direct personal offense to Asuka, as the Rei and Gendo parent-guardian relationship can be an undistinguished comparison to Asuka and her mother. Asuka's near attempt of suicide with her mother was held back due to fear, to which Rei casually proclaims that she would be willing to die if ordered to. Like a puppet, like a doll, Asuka was having none of it.
I am not a doll.
You are! You do anything you're ordered to, don't you? You'd kill yourself if your commander told you to, wouldn't you?
Of course.
By the end of the entire aerial encounter, Asuka is utterly defeated, and to make matters worse, she was saved by Rei, of all people. And in the last few moments of that episode, Shinji tries to confront her, to which she voices out how she hates everything and everyone. A great, impactful scene, completely ruined by the overly cheery and high energy music of the ending song that just out of nowhere starts blaring.
That little bitch Ray rescued me! Don't you know that I'd rather have died? I hate her! I hate you, Shinji! I hate everything!
Holy shit!
Asuka tells Shinji in a few instances how she hates him because he reminds her so much of herself. At this time, Asuka is at an all-time low and ran away from home, just as Shinji did in episode 4, but in her case, with the probable intent of suicide. This is the last few times we see her in the show before going to the last 2 episodes. She runs off this abandoned shack where we see her clothes neatly folded on a chair and her fragile, naked body suffering from malnutrition, laying in a decrepit bathtub, reflecting on death and how she's ultimately useless. No signs of fan service, no hope, just a raw visual representation of depression. The last moments we see of her is when the nerve personnel come to get her and put her in the hospital for treatment. The last 2 episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion are brilliant. How we mentioned at the beginning, everything and everyone eventually gets a relatively deep look into their psyche. Eva accomplishes this in a really interesting way. I won't reiterate things that I've talked about in other videos, but basically the final impact resulted in the world being unified in LCL. More importantly, we physically see this take place in the end of Evangelion, but in the show, the last 2 episodes are within the subconscious of all the characters. We see the raw, true emotions and feelings of many of the characters here, not just Shinji's. Now we get to finally realize Misato's, Shinji, Rei's, Asuka's inner self by observing their subconscious thoughts and challenges. Everything in Evangelion at this point was shrouded in delusion or lack of explanation, so it's almost bizarre to hear each character speak in such a open and truthful way about themselves. We are sort of expected to question everything asserted in the show so far. We are supposed to come up with our own conclusions, but in this case, in the last few episodes, the characters' confessions are so blatant and real that it's almost difficult to digest. Hearing Asuka cry out for help like this is almost out of character and unsettling.
Asuka, you're still a child.
Why are you there, damn you? You don't do anything! You won't help me! You won't even hold me! You're no one! No one! No one!
So I don't want to depend on anybody. But I hate it at the same time. It's a pain. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to be alone. Don't kill me.
Shinji wasn't the only one who, during this time, came up with an epiphany, a sense of understanding about himself and others. It was also the rest of the characters. We know the time Shinji truly understood himself and others, he ultimately rejected the Instrumentality Project, which in the last few episodes was the congratulations scene, and in the movie it was, of course, the collapse of the final impact. It was also during this time where we see Asuka and Shinji confronting each other, presumably somewhere in the void of instrumentality. We can see their destructive love-hate relationship here. While they're in this intimate position, of course, proving her dominance, Asuka's on top. She says to Shinji, "The sight of you makes me so irritated," to which Shinji replies with, "It's because we're so similar." Shinji at this point finally gets it. He finally gets Asuka. I just want to point out quickly how thoughtful this shot composition was in Evangelion at this particular scene, where we see, usually when we see 2 individuals in a somewhat positive light or in a process of getting closer to one another, both characters are in one frame without any kind of disconnect. In the scene where Shinji and Gendo are visiting Yui's grave together, the entire shot is fixated on both of their expressions and interactions, while in the intimate scene with Shinji and Asuka, there's a clear divide or disconnect. The only way we can assure that the scene is happening in the same exact moment is because they're both naked on top of each other and Asuka's hair is like cascading over Shinji. If framed any other way, it would be hard to discern when the scene was taking place or who the conversation was even directed to. In that particular scene, it was made very clear that both understand each other when they're conversing about their attitudes about one another. Shinji understands Asuka's frustration at this point, and her words finally make sense to him, as before he was too dense to realize she was longing for him the entire time. There are many parts of the show that suggest Asuka is Shinji's equivalent other, like how in the beginning of episode 26, we have a scene where Shinji is transparent with like rapid alternating imagery focused inside of him. This scene has been compared to Picasso's idea that art is something that's inside of a frame, and it receives its value or meaning because it's actually a mirror that reflects its message back to you. In a classical way, Shinji is what he sees. He is the frame. He sees all the conflicts and complications within himself, but the only thing that appears outside of the frame is Asuka. When Asuka's Eva was uncooperative, she asserts that it's her toy and it must obey her. Presumably, this is how she would act to anyone who abandons her. She doesn't understand at this point that it's her mother's soul that's infused within the Eva. And with the only way she knows best, she asserts her dominance and forces the Eva to obey her, which results in a zero-sync ratio and a complete inability to operate the Eva whatsoever. Asuka's epiphany comes very soon after. In Asuka's case, her epiphany was only fully realized when she was justifiably near death. She realized that her mother was always with her, within the Eva, and was always protecting her.
Mama! Mama, now I understand! The meaning of the AT field! You were always protecting me! Always watching over me!
In the last few episodes of the show, she verbally proclaims this to both herself and Shinji, while in the movie, it was a direct parallel to the moment she reactivates her Eva with full force and realizing her mother had always been there for her, protecting her from death. What happened afterwards was probably the best Eva fight in the entire series. Despite her being defeated, she gave everything she had and displayed the highest level of understanding about how and what the Evangelion really were. When Asuka came back at the end, after the strangulation scene, Asuka is shown to caress Shinji's face. Her reaction may come across as a surprise at this point because, throughout the entire series, Asuka's hatred towards Shinji can be viewed as misdirected hatred for herself. The moment she shows this calming sign of affection, it can be seen as an act of acceptance meant to symbolize Asuka's growth. Her kindness at this point towards Shinji means that she can finally accept him, accept who he was, and subsequently accept herself. Asuka and Shinji are fundamentally one and the same. When Shinji is taken back by her caress, he binges and cries, realizing that instrumentality had ended and that both him and Asuka have come to terms with each other in this destructive and saddening way they only know how. Not to mention the ending cover of the end of Evangelion is the moments that take place after the final impact. We see Asuka and Shinji composed and side by side together once again. As stated earlier in the movie to Shinji, Asuka says, "How do you expect to love and understand others when you can't even love yourself? You're all that you have, and you never learn to like yourself." Her most powerful line. In the same way Asuka hated Shinji because he reminded her of herself, the moment she showed affection and love towards him shows that she's willing to love and accept herself.